$100,000, a father on a podcast, a son in the crosshairs, and a single viral sentence that quietly detonated an entire family's reputation in front of millions. What looked like a casual money comment may have actually been the moment a private father-son system cracked wide open in public. And once that crack appeared, everything started spilling out. On March 3rd, 2026, T.I. sat down with Wallo on an episode of his podcast Expeditiously. The conversation was supposed to be about parenting, money, and raising kids in fame, but nobody expected one specific claim to hijack the entire internet. T.I. opened up about his children and how differently they approach him when it comes to money. And then he dropped the line that would echo everywhere like a warning shot. The quote spread across the internet immediately. The clip from the 2-hour episode was shared by Killer Crew on X and garnered over 369,000 views with 4,773 likes and 838 bookmarks. That one line, "King asked for $100,000 like it ain't nothing," became the story. Not the context, not the nuance, just that number, $100,000, hanging in the air like proof of entitlement. And suddenly, King Harris wasn't just a son anymore in the public eye. He was a headline, a symbol, a problem. T.I. didn't stop there. He widened the contrast, and this is where things start to feel less like storytelling and more like positioning. He began comparing King to his other children, painting two completely different realities inside the same household. According to him, Domani, Deja, and Major refuse to accept money. But then, Domani don't want a dime. He won't accept no money. Deja, she won't accept no money, he explained. He also mentioned his youngest son, Major. He don't want no money. And just like that, King became the outlier, the one name standing alone in the financial narrative of his own family. One son asking for six-figure sums, the others refusing $1. The reaction was instant and brutal. Social media didn't pause to ask questions. It judged, it dissected, it laughed. It turned a father's frustration into ammunition against a son who had grown up in cameras, wealth, and expectation. People weren't debating context, they were reacting to the image. A 21-year-old casually requesting $100,000 from a hip-hop mogul father like it's pocket change. But what no one noticed at first is what wasn't said. T.I. never explained what the money was for, and that silence would become the most explosive missing piece in the entire story, because on the surface it looked like entitlement. But behind the scenes, something else was forming, something King Harris would later step in to defend publicly. King eventually responded, and when he did, he didn't deny the number, he redefined it. He reframed the entire accusation into something completely different. He claimed he doesn't go to his father for lifestyle money, not for bills, not for spending, not for luxuries. According to him, this wasn't a handout situation at all. It was business. It was investment capital. He said, "I only go to him for investments. I don't have to go to the bank. I go to him." And suddenly the narrative split in two directions like a fault line. One version, a spoiled son asking for $100,000. The other version, a young entrepreneur going directly to his richest, most accessible investor. And now the question starts shifting in a way nobody expected. Was T.I. exposing entitlement or unintentionally exposing a misunderstanding between how he sees money and how his son sees opportunity? Because if King is telling the truth, then this isn't about spending at all. It's about capital, risk, growth, and family being the first funding source instead of institutional gatekeepers. But T.I. never gave that version of events when he first told the story. And that omission changes everything. Because once you remove the word investment, what's left sounds very different. It sounds like dependency, like privilege, like a child leaning too heavily on a father who has already done everything to build a legacy from nothing. And that is exactly how the internet interpreted it. A spoiled kid, a rich dad, a $100,000 request that became a cultural flashpoint overnight. But behind the outrage, another layer of tension was already sitting in plain sight. King Harris is not a stranger to public conflict. He grew up on reality television through T.I. and Tiny, The Family Hustle. His life was never private enough to develop without an audience. Every phase of growth was documented. Every argument had witnesses. Every evolution came with commentary. And now he's an adult, still living under that same spotlight, still being interpreted through clips, sound bites, and viral moments that rarely tell the full story. And just when it looked like the narrative had settled, King spoke again, and the situation began to tilt in a completely different direction, one that raised even more questions about what's really going on behind closed doors. Because on April 3rd, 2026, King Harris went on record to clarify, Everything. And instead of calming the storm, his explanation cracked it open even wider. He didn't back away from the $100,000 figure. He didn't deny going to his father. He didn't even try to soften the public perception of the number. Instead, he reframed the entire accusation in a way that made people stop scrolling for a second and actually reconsider what they thought they knew. King explained that he only goes to his father for investments, not for spending money, not for bills, not for lifestyle expenses. He goes to TI for investment capital. He said, "I only go to him for investments. I don't have to go to the bank. I go to him." And that one sentence flipped the entire narrative upside down. Because suddenly the image of entitlement didn't look so clean anymore. It started looking like something else entirely. A son treating his father like a financial institution, like a first investor, like a backing source for ideas that haven't even reached the market yet. But here's where things get suspicious, or at least deeply inconsistent. If King's version is accurate, why wasn't that context part of TI's original story? Why did the public only hear the number, not the purpose? That gap is where the entire controversy starts bleeding from. Because in storytelling, omission is never neutral. It shapes perception. It decides who looks responsible and who looks reckless. And in this case, the omission turned a possible business conversation into a viral judgment. TI didn't lie, but he also didn't explain. And that difference is everything. Because when you tell the world your son asked you for $100,000 and you don't clarify that it's for investment, the audience fills in the blanks themselves. And the internet is not gentle when it fills blanks. It builds characters, it builds villains. It builds stories that feel true even when they're incomplete. And in this version of the story, King became the spoiled rich kid, and TI became the frustrated father who had seen enough. But behind the viral moment, there is another layer that makes this even more complicated. The history of this family in public conflict. The Harris family has never really lived outside of cameras. Reality television made their private life public property years ago. TI and Tiny, the family hustle, didn't just document moments, it trained an audience to expect access. So when drama appears now, it doesn't feel like intrusion. It feels like continuation, like the next episode. And King Harris, now grown, is still being viewed through that same lens, except now the stakes are higher. He's not just a child in a household anymore. He's a father himself. A man trying to build music and business credibility under the shadow of one of Atlanta's most influential hip-hop figures. And shadows like that don't just fade. They overlap everything. But the situation escalated further in the background of something much bigger, a family already coming off one of the most publicized hip-hop feuds involving TI and 50 Cent. Diss tracks, Instagram posts, old footage resurfacing. Entire narratives being dragged back into the present like unfinished business refusing to stay buried. King didn't stay silent during that chaos either. He stepped in publicly. He defended his family. He escalated when necessary. At one point, even digging into controversial material online that pushed the conflict into darker territory than most expected. And that detail matters because it destroys the idea that he is passive, dependent, or disconnected from responsibility. He has been in the fight. He has been in the fire. So when that same father later describes him as casually asking for $100,000 like it's nothing, the contrast becomes almost impossible to ignore. One version of King is aggressive, protective, outspoken. Another version is financially dependent and entitled. Two images, same person. Completely different outcomes depending on what gets emphasized. And that's where the tension of this entire story lives. Not in the money itself, but in the framing of it. Because framing decides everything. A request for capital becomes a demand for luxury. A conversation about investment becomes a narrative of entitlement. A father's frustration becomes public evidence. And a son's clarification becomes damage control. But the truth, if it exists cleanly at all, is somewhere tangled in between those interpretations, buried under clips, reactions, and selective memory. What is undeniable is this. Both father and son are now speaking through the public instead of to each other. Every statement becomes content. Every clarification becomes fuel. Every silence becomes suspicion. And in that environment, resolution becomes almost impossible. Because the internet doesn't wait for closure, it waits for the next angle. And the Harris family, whether they intended it or not, has become a recurring storyline in that cycle. Fame, family, money, loyalty, legacy, all of it compressed into one viral argument about 100,000s that refuses to stay simple. And even now, after explanations, clarifications, and counter-narratives, one question still hangs in the air like unfinished business. Was this ever really about money, or about control, perception, and who gets to define the story of a family that the world already believes it knows. And as long as both sides keep speaking publicly instead of privately, that question is not going anywhere. It's only getting louder.